Chairman Comer, you said it in your opening statement and in the letter that you sent to the Rules Committee that you request an appropriate rule for this legislation. What is that?
Appropriate rule that we hold criminals
open
accountable.
rule or closed rule or amendments, or what is an appropriate rule? What are you asking for?
An appropriate rule.
Well, what is the definition of that?
A rule that is appropriate. This is a rule this is the Rules Committee. We want an appropriate rule to go on the floor to where we can do our job and hold criminals accountable.
What is your opinion, since you put it in your letter and you put it in your opening statement? What is your opinion of what an appropriate rule is? I mean, would an appropriate rule be a closed rule?
Whatever the Rules Committee deems appropriate.
Yeah, well, yeah, you know, that's then I mean, I asked the question because you used the word appropriate. You could have just said I request a rule, but you said an appropriate rule, and maybe the chair of the Rules Committee can tell us what an appropriate rule is. I'm not. My Republican friends like to use that, but I don't. No one can define it for me. I mean, I don't know what. Maybe it's hiding behind one of the statues in the Capitol or something. We can go look for it. But I'm just curious. I mean, you're asking us to bring a bill to the floor, and you ask for an appropriate rule, but you can't define what appropriate is.
I mean, with all due respect, Mr. Reagan-Beer, this is a very serious issue, and I think you're trying to make a joke out of it. And I go through this in Oversight Committee with Raskin's little lapdog, Moskowitz, but
Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
oh, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Denis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Blue City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville, I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I've never, I mean, I'm sure in the course of history, there's been.
By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
Do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not.
Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
Okay, well,
That's just a little teaser as to what you're about to see. Please, if you have 20 minutes or so, sit down. This is brilliant. For me, it sums up everything that's currently going on in Congress, between the difference between how the Republican Party are carrying out their hearings, etc., and how the Democrats are carrying out their hearings. We'll hear from Raskin. We'll hear some more from McGovern. And James Comer is, you get the idea, he is just out of his depth. Literally.
The Support Act rebukes President Biden's unilateral decision to pause arms transfer, ensure prompt delivery of the transfers, and reasserts congressional support for Israel. I look forward to the opportunity to advance these pro-law enforcement measures and to set the record straight on America's support for Israel. I will now yield to our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
well, thank you, Madam Chair, and wow, after that opening statement, let me just say to anybody who's watching this hearing on C-SPAN, please don't let the chair's comments dissuade you from coming to visit the nation's capital. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people come to this building, this Capitol building, every single day to learn about our history, to meet with their members of Congress, and they do so without incident. So please don't be frightened away from coming to visit Washington or talking to your representatives. It is National Police Week, which means we are back with several messaging bills that do absolutely nothing to actually keep people safe and instead highlight the Republican Party's total hypocrisy when it comes to law enforcement. Many of the measures before us today demonize migrants and continue to push Republicans' tired, unconstructive, and baseless attacks on President Biden. It's sad and a total waste of time. But let's be honest, that's what Republicans are good at. Now, let me remind everyone There was a comprehensive bipartisan border security bill in the Senate. If House Republicans wanted to take action on the border, they had a chance. Instead, they killed it. And when we have a non-binding resolution to support law enforcement and oppose efforts, and then we have a non-binding resolution to support law enforcement and impose efforts to, quote, defund the police. This resolution is almost comical, considering just last month, the Republican Study Committee, which all but one of my Republican friends across the dais are proud members of, released a proposal to gut the Community-Oriented Policing Services Program, the COPS program, which provides grants that support hiring, retaining, and training officers. And that just scratches the surface. 21 Republicans, including 3 members of this committee, voted against awarding police officers the Congressional Gold Medal for their service on January 6th. And I noticed in the chair's opening statement, not a mention of the Capitol Police officers who protected all of us and our staff on January 6th. Over a dozen Republicans voted to fire 2,000 Customs and Border Patrol police officers in May 2022, including 3 Republican members on this committee. And over 50 Republicans voted to cut federal support for local law enforcement agencies in September 2022. They voted to fire 400 cops and cut crime prevention grants by an average of $1 million per state. Republican members have called to abolish the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the ATF. So as I see it, the only political party in Congress actively defunding and challenging the police is the GOP. Now, meanwhile, Democrats want to keep communities safe. We want to address gun violence in our schools, an issue I hear from police officers all the time, but yet silence from my Republican colleagues. We want to invest in programs that get to the root causes of crime. We want to make sure that police aren't put in situations that they aren't trained to handle. And we know the key to improving safety in our neighborhoods is not to use law enforcement officers like political pawns. Now, sadly, that is what every single one of these law enforcement related bills does. Additionally, before us is a bill called the Israel Security Assistance Support Act. This radical bill would cripple our national security apparatus and run counter to longstanding policy and law. This bill basically gets rid of human rights checks and balances already in place on arms transfers. And it would interfere with any administration's ability to comply with U.S. obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. And by the way, 3 U.S. presidents have threatened to pause military aid to Israel. 3 Republican presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. And all three times it happened during a moment of crisis. And this should not be a partisan issue. It should be obvious that if you want U.S. military assistance, it doesn't come with no strings attached. If our taxpayers are paying for it, they ought to know that it's not being used in a way that runs counter to our laws and our values. And Madam Chair, let me just say, you know, we can be friends with Israel while also expressing our anger and frustration with the policies of the Netanyahu government. His bombing has been, in my opinion, indiscriminate and wrong. And I, for one, think we ought to tell him that we don't support his decision to invade Rafah, one of the most heavily populated areas in Gaza. We are talking about tens of thousands of civilian casualties, over 1 million people hungry. Where is our humanity? And I don't care what country kills civilians. It is wrong. It is against U.S. law to use our weapons to violate international humanitarian laws. And by the way, we do have a law that says that if a country frustrates the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in a conflict, that basically we are to freeze that aid. There's a famine happening right now in Gaza that it is amazing to me that so many of my friends on the other side of the aisle seem indifferent to. And there are people who are literally on the verge of starvation who have nothing to do with Hamas, who have nothing to do with any violence against the Israeli civilian population or against anybody. And so it's at some point, at some point, we have to make sure that what we send to any country in the world is not being used in a way that, quite frankly, violates international humanitarian law, and our own values. So I, again, regret that that's what we're going to spend our time with on the floor this week. But again, my friends are in control, and it really is quite sad what we're seeing unfold here. And with that, I yield back. Chairman Comer, you said it in your opening statement and in the letter that you sent to the Rules Committee that you request an appropriate rule for this legislation. What is that?
Appropriate rule that we hold criminals
Is it an open
accountable.
rule or closed rule or amendments, or what is an appropriate rule? What are you asking for?
An appropriate rule.
Well, what is the definition of that?
A rule that is appropriate. This is a rule this is the Rules Committee. We want an appropriate rule to go on the floor to where we can do our job and hold
What's your
criminals
opinion?
accountable.
What is your opinion, since you put it in your letter and you put it in your opening statement? What is your opinion of what an appropriate rule is? I mean, would an appropriate rule be a closed rule?
Whatever the Rules Committee deems appropriate.
That's then I mean, because I asked the question because you used the word appropriate. You could have just said, I request a rule, but you said an appropriate rule, and maybe the chair of the Rules Committee can tell us what an appropriate rule is. I'm not, my Republican friends like to use that, but I don't, no one can define it for me. I mean, I don't know what, maybe it's hiding behind one of the statues in the Capitol or something. We can go look for it, but I'm just curious. I mean, you're asking us to bring a bill to the floor. And you ask for an appropriate rule, but you can't define what appropriate is.
I mean, with all due respect, Mr. Reagan-Beer, this is a very serious issue, and I think you're trying to make a joke out of it. And I go through this in Oversight Committee with Raskin's little lapdog Moskowitz, but the people in Washington D.C. are furious with this out of control crime in Washington D.C. The House Oversight Committee has legislative jurisdiction over Washington D.C., and we are trying to do what the people want and make this city safe for its residents and all the millions of tourists that come here every year.
Well, anyway, I appreciate that, and I just want the record to reflect that you use a word in your letter and in your testimony that you can't define, which,
I did define it.
Yeah, you just
An
said appropriate means
appropriate rule.
appropriate. I don't,
Okay.
again, I don't, let me, who's the author of this bill?
This is Byron Donald's
All
bill.
right, where's he from? He's from Florida? Mr. Raskin, are you aware that in Florida, adults can be treated as juveniles up to 24?
I believe that's the same rule that DC has, and
Right.
both of those are more liberal rules than we have in Maryland,
Right.
but we want to leave it up, I think, to each state and local government to decide for itself.
I guess the question is, why does the author of this bill think it's inappropriate for DC, but it's okay for his home state of Florida?
Well, but I wish my friend Mr. Roy were still here because I really wanted to respond to some of the things that he said that
Go
go
ahead.
right to your point.
Use it.
But I do believe that there's an effort here to scapegoat Washington, D.C. I mean, my friend from Texas that seems to be completely unaware of everything that Mayor Bowser in Washington and Chairman Mendelson, the chairman of the council, and the 13-member city council have been doing to fight crime in the city, which is part, of course, of a nationwide wave. And in fact, they've had real practical effect, positive effect. Total crime in DC this year is already down 16%. Violent crime is down 25%, and homicide is down 20%. So several months ago, they passed something called the Secure DC Act, which would be illegitimate under the legislation that our friends on the GOP side have brought forth today. They increased the criminal penalty for possession of a sawed-off shotgun or a ghost gun. And I know some of them don't like legislation relating to ghost guns, but in DC, they brought a criminal penalty for it. They increased penalty for possession of a machine gun. Again, I know some people don't like that, but the people in DC decided to do it. They increased penalty for repeat sexual abuse. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed in the parks of DC and in recreational property. They increased and enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against vulnerable adults, people with a mental disability or older people. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against rideshare drivers, transit operators, metro rail station managers, and employees and passengers. There's been an epidemic of crime against people who drive buses and metros across the country, and they took action against it. They also created a whole bunch of new offenses for possession of a firearm with intent to sell. Again, I know some of my friends who fashion themselves Second Amendment champions don't like any legislation like they passed in DC that criminalizes the selling of firearms. They created a new offense for strangulation. They created a new offense for directing organized retail theft. They created a new offense for possessing a firearm with a removed or altered serial number. They created a new offense for firing bullets in public. They created a new offense for the unlawful discarding of a firearm or ammunition outside of the law. Again, that may or may not be right for Maryland or Kentucky or Minnesota, but that's what they chose in DC, and they're taking action. And I just think it's an insult and an affront to fellow Americans, albeit unrepresented by voting members in the House and the Senate, to just blindly overturn all of their laws, accuse them of doing nothing, accuse them of not caring about the public safety and public welfare in their own jurisdiction, and then make it impossible for them to create any new offenses. And I'm starting to think maybe it's because so many of their offenses have to do with the problem of gun violence, and maybe that's why they want to essentially legislatively disarm the people in Washington, D.C.
Well, I appreciate that, and I wish when they talk about crime, they talked about gun deaths, and the top states for gun deaths are Mississippi, Louisiana, New Mexico, Alabama, Montana, Missouri, Alaska, Arkansas, South Carolina, Tennessee, Wyoming, and Arizona. But for whatever reason, they don't like to talk about that. Mr. Raskin, let me get this straight now. So our Republican colleagues portray this bill that is before us as tough on crime. Let me ask you a couple of, I'll make this quick, so yes or no questions. Would this bill that we're dealing with right now, what they call the DC Crimes Act, would it permanently prohibit the DC Council from increasing the penalties for murder, child sexual abuse, rape, carjacking, and every other crime?
Yes, and my friends have not denied it.
Okay. It strikes me that this bill not only prohibits the DC Council from increasing or decreasing criminal penalties, but could be construed to prohibit the DC Council from establishing any new crimes at all, since DC could not, quote, change any criminal liability sentence. Creating a new criminal penalty could be construed as a change. You agree with that?
I absolutely agree, and you could only create a new crime if it did not have a sentence attached to it.
So you mentioned in March, the DC Council passed the Secure DC Omnibus Amendment Act, which increased penalties for, among other things, gun crimes, such as possession of a machine gun and child sexual abuse. It also created new crimes such as strangulation and firing bullets in public. Is it true that this bill, we're talking about here today, would have prevented the DC Council from passing the Secure DC Omnibus Amendment Act?
Yes, and it seems like several of their new statutory offenses related to gun crimes and crimes related to gun violence, and that might be part of the motivation in trying to wipe out their legislative authority.
And as you know, this Congress, I think by any measure, is dysfunctional and can only seem to get around to bringing over the finish line must-pass bills. So under this bill, would Congress be the only entity that could increase or decrease statutory penalties in DC?
Yes.
Now, former President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over DC. And I think my Republican friends like this power game that they play. I mean, they could actually give DC more representation in Congress with enhanced voting rights for our delegate, give her the same rights as we all have, and maybe even talk about 2 U.S. senators. But he has talked about taking over the DC government. Legislation has been introduced to repeal DC Home Rule Act. Home rule has been under greater threat in this Congress than in a generation. Should DC residents be worried that a Republican Congress, and God forbid, a Republican president, should they be worried that they could abolish the DC government entirely?
Well, that should be among their worries, given the hypothetical you've just offered, yes.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I mean, Mr. Raskin, when he began He talked about how the crime rate in DC has gone down. Just so that there's no misunderstanding, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the Metropolitan Police Department 2024 year-to-date crime comparison as of today, May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Did you have something you want to add, Mr. Raskin?
Well, but I would just say this, I think not just with respect to DC, but with respect to horizontal federalism generally, I think that we should be cautious about looking at other states and seeing that they punish this or that offense less severely than our own state, and thereby call them soft on crime. In the District of Columbia, for example, there is a maximum penalty for armed robbery of 30 years. In the chairman's home state of Kentucky, it's 20 years for armed robbery. Does that make the people of Kentucky soft on crime? Well, I would reject that. I would say that they are responding to whatever they think the various legislative factors are. For unarmed robbery in DC, it's 15 years. In Kentucky, it's 10 years. So it's 50% higher for both armed robbery and robbery in the District of Columbia than it is in Kentucky. We've had conversations in committee before about carjacking. The maximum penalty for carjacking someone in Washington is 40 years. Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
Oh, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Dennis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Blue City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville. I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I'm sure in the course of history, there's been some, but you have one a day in Washington, D.C., sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And with armed robbery, the burglar's there's a lot higher chance if a burglar's going to try to rob someone in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, that they're going to.
So is that an argument to lower the penalties?
Because
That's why they're lower
Kentucky
penalties.
Yeah.
merchants, many Kentucky homeowners practice their right to bear arms, and that's a disincentive for burglars to commit armed robbery in Kentucky versus cities where they have excessive limits on guns. So the gun issue goes both ways. It can also be a detriment to crime.
But in any event, my point, Mr. McGovern, was simply that the people in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, not part of my jurisdiction, but it is under the jurisdiction of the Oversight Committee, the people in Washington, D.C. are taking their crime problem seriously, as I'm sure the people of Louisville are and the rest of Kentucky are. And there's crime all across the country. And apparently what they've been doing in Washington, D.C. has been working, as they've had fairly dramatic reductions in violent crime and in homicide.
So under this bill, basically, I mean, the DC Council could not even increase penalties without Congress doing it for them, which I think, and this Congress can't even, pass what they have for lunch. Never mind, serious legislation of any kind. Did you want to add one other thing?
Well, I mean, that's what American federalism is about. And the district constituting the seat of government, far from being the colonial plaything of those of us who come from other states, it should be accorded the same kind of deference that we accord the other states in terms of them making their judgments. By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
Do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not.
Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
Okay, well, I appreciate your answers to my question. I think this is a joke, quite frankly, that we're doing this. And again, this is par for the course. With that, I yield back.